Welcome to our webinar, everyone, today. Tim's going to be talking about why AI projects fail and how to make sure yours don't and you get yours right. So thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody that we are recording this session and we'll be sending it out, the recording and Tim's slides after a few days after the webinar. So you will have all of that and you can share them with your colleagues if you'd like. So be on the lookout for that email in the next few days. Our speaker today is happy to take questions throughout the webinar, and at the end, there'll be time for Q&A if we haven't covered all of them. And if you have any questions, please submit them in the comments or the Q&A session as they come up throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to get to them. So let's go ahead and get started by introducing our speaker today, Dr. Tim Oates. Tim is the co-founder and chief data scientist here at Synaptic with over 20 years of experience in guiding organizations and companies of all sizes applying AI and machine learning to business problems across industries. Tim earned his PhD in computer science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. The Minutemen, I just learned, is the mascot, with a focus in AI and machine learning, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the MIT AI Lab. Thank you, Tim, for speaking today. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So I just want to spend a minute talking about Synaptic. We've been in business for a while now, and back in the early days, we did a lot of what I would call old school machine learning, AI, data science consulting. So a lot of kind of fixed price projects where somebody would come in and say, "Hey, we need machine learning to help solve this very specific business problem." And we would do that, and did it pretty successfully. Over time, though, we found that there's a lot more these days, especially that wraps around machine learning and AI initiatives. So, as we'll talk about a lot today, the data are important, and so actually, we've branched out into data engineering. So, how do you move the data around? How do you get it into a central location so that you can actually do fun things with AI on it? But then also, a lot of people are building projects that might be externally facing or even internally facing, where the internal client is somebody who needs a nice interface or user experience to work through. So we talk about ourselves in terms of building intelligent products. How do we get the data into the right place? How do we apply AI and machine learning methods to it? And then finally, how do we expose all that information to either internal or external facing customers in a way that makes it useful to them? So that's what sort of what the company does. Here's the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So it's sort of all about where do AI projects go wrong, and what might you do to avoid some of those pitfalls. And a lot of this comes from me being involved in AI data science consulting for more than 10 years at this point. So first thing we'll do is we'll start out just looking at some statistics about AI projects. There are a couple of reports that I think do a good job of summarizing sort of what people are thinking about when they start them and the troubles that they feel like they run into. Then I've got 5 common failure modes that I'm going to talk about. We'll talk about the failure mode. We'll say, like, what is it? Why does it happen? What does it look like when it's happening? And what can you do instead? So we'll sort of go through those. And in the end, I'll have just a few kind of concluding thoughts. So as Diane said, if you have questions, like I'm just looking at my slides, she can see what's going on behind the scenes. So if you have a question, just kind of pop it into the chat and I'll be happy to address that. And Diane will, interrupt me if there's something that I should talk about. So what are some statistics about AI projects? So the MIT Technology Review Surveys branch did a very interesting survey about AI and machine learning projects that companies of a variety of sizes are embarking on. And so the first thing that we looked at, or that they looked at, that we'll talk about, are sort of what are executives trying to do. And so this plot shows they said, hey, here are some selections. What kinds of things are you trying to accomplish with your AI initiatives? And rank them your first choice, second choice, and third choice, right? So if you sum the gray bars, they'll add up to approximately 100. If you'll sum the sort of light blue and dark blue bars, they'll add up to approximately 100, right? Because everybody had a first, second, and third choice. And so the thing that's interesting here, which we see a lot, is that they're saying we want to increase efficiency or productivity. So I will say Synaptic is a data science, machine learning AI company. And we have got a lot of initiatives internally trying to make us more productive. So, we're not a huge company. And so we've got a lot of processes that have kind of grown organically through the years. And over the past couple of years, and especially this year in particular, the past 12 months, there's been a lot of focus for us trying to say, can we use AI tools to make those things faster, more efficient, to reduce friction, so that the people in the company can just spend more time getting work done, doing part of it that's fun. I mean, I actually really enjoy working on these projects, as opposed to, kind of doing the stuff you need to do to make sure that the machinery around you works well. So, increased market competitiveness, innovation or product services, those are all things that came in as being high on the list. You want to make more money and you want to reduce costs, but it really is, and a lot of what we see with other companies is we want to be able to do things more efficiently and do things faster. So the other question is, and this is a big one, is how, like, how's your data doing? Are you ready to make the leap from, sort of your current organization to be a bit more data driven? And we'll talk about that phrase again in a minute. And it's very interesting because 22% say, like, yeah, we're really ready. Our data is ready to go. 8% are like, we're really unready. We're somewhat unready is 17%, and kind of somewhat ready is 53%. So I will say, and again, I'll have more to say about this in a minute, is that sort of data readiness can be a huge blocker. So it's like it's interesting that in this MIT review study, they were calling that out. So the other question is, what's hard for you? And again, notice the focus on data governance, security, and privacy. Like 59% are saying that's hard. Data quality or the timeliness of data. Is the data there when I need to make a decision? And then data silos or data integration challenges are big ones. Now, cost or resource investment, that's a big one as well. So I often see within companies, they'll say, hey, we've got this great idea. There's usually some tech champion that says, like, this could really be a game changer for us, but you've got to get somebody who owns money inside the company to invest in it. So if you look at those top four, it's all about data, right? Like, can we get to the data? Is it good data? Can we integrate it together and bring it together? And then can we spend the money on it? So those two things, the money and the data, tend to be big blockers for companies to make progress on these kinds of projects. And then finally, are the projects having an impact? So S&P Global Market Intelligence produced a report that had a lot of really interesting statistics in it. And the thing that they talked about that's kind of shocking is that the failure rate is rising. So, companies were abandoning AI initiatives before production. It went from 17% to 42% year over year. Now, the question is, why is that happening? It could be the case that, with large language models and generative AI, basically, your 10-year-old kid can use Claude code to go create an app and release it on the App Store, right? And so there are probably lots and lots of companies, more companies that are kind of dipping their toe in. And I think what they're finding, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that gap between, my 10-year-old made this really cool demo versus I want to productionalize this thing is massive. It's still there, right? So it is the case that the bottom line there on this slide is that, among people who are investing in Gen AI, 46% say no single enterprise objective saw a strong positive impact, and that's a scary statistic. And then also just, saying, did you have some positive impact? That's declining year over year in terms of looking at revenue growth, cost management, or risk management. So, despite all the promise of AI, there are lots of companies that are kind of getting into it and going, it didn't really go as well as we thought it would go. So, against that backdrop, I want to talk about some common failure modes. And like I said, I got 5 of these things and we've got plenty of time to make it through them. So the one is the problem framing. So how do you actually say, like, what are we going to do? We go, hey, we want to, like, get into this AI game. And the little cartoon over there on the right could be, Alice in AI land, right? And so there's this AI rabbit hole you can go down, and the rabbit is going, hurry up and adopt or you'll be late. And Alice is like, I don't know. I'm not sure where I'm going. Like, shouldn't I have a map of this thing? And I think a lot of people wind up going down the rabbit hole. And what it looks like is it's sort of vague. Like from the top, people are saying we need to use AI, we got to use generative AI, we got to be more data driven. That last one we hear a lot. We need to be more data driven. And I think that comes from a good place, right? So companies think, hey, we're sort of engaged in a particular kind of business. That business is throwing off all kinds of data. We ought to be able to use that data to do things better. But the goal has to be more specific than that. And so often what you'll see is there's sort of like this focus on the output. We're going to build a chatbot. We're going to train a machine learning model as opposed to we're going to improve a decision. And sometimes success is evaluated based on a demo, not a business outcome. And I will say that that's exacerbated by the fact that with modern AI tools, you can bang out a demo that looks really good and feels like it's almost fully baked in a couple of days, right? I mean, I've done that. And the problem then is that you see this demo and everybody's like, great, it worked. But you really have to focus on a business outcome. So, why do the projects fail when it's vague? We want to be more data driven. So the problem is you haven't sort of identified a decision or a pain point that you want to improve. And so it's hard to be actionable with the output of it. If you don't have a metric, you can't tell if you're winning. You also need to know, like, if you're trying to improve something, how's it going today, right? Like if there's no baseline, if you can't say that's the thing we're trying to improve, then you can't say here's what the ROI is. And then furthermore, you get into this, like if there's no definition of whether things are good enough, you get into these endless debates of it, like how well is it doing? Oh, it's 80%, right? Like, I don't know, we should go for 85%. Now it's 85%. Oh, we should go for 90% accuracy. And so you're just sort of stuck in this purgatory. And so what you see is like the requirements are always changing. Somebody comes along and goes, well, that's pretty cool. Can it also do this thing? And again, the teams are sort of thinking about accuracy without agreeing on impact, right? So it's often the case, especially with sort of more old school AI projects that we would do at the company. People would say, I want it to be 95% accurate, right? Which is great. I like, high 90s in terms of accuracy on a predictive model is good, but do you need it to be 95% accurate? Right? Like, what would 80% accuracy do for you on a particular metric? And so, you know, here's what to do instead. And this is going to sound like just really kind of like common sense, but I think with the fear of missing out, right? Sort of Alice in AI land, people want to charge headlong. And you need to think about sort of like what's the decision that you're trying to impact? What's the workflow that you're trying to change? Who uses it, where and when? What does better mean? I think picking a single primary KPI, the key performance indicator, is a good idea. And then have a couple of guardrail metrics. And actually, guardrail metrics in this case, we'll look at the next slide. We'll have a couple of examples, but it means, hey, let's make sure that if you're moving the KPI in the right direction, you're not breaking other things, which can happen. Also, you have to say, well, if we're trying to improve that workflow step or improve that decision, what's the baseline today, right? How long does it take to make those decisions? What kind of error rate do we see? How does that decision impact revenue? So what is our revenue based on the way we're doing it today? And then what's good enough, right? So if here's the baseline, what do we need to be able to get out of this project so that we'll go, yep, that was actually having a positive impact on our business. And then how are we going to measure that thing? And we have seen um, a large range of ways of measuring things. And I'll talk about one particularly nice example in a minute. So, are we going to do some offline evaluation? Are we going to run it over historical data and see would we have done better? Are we going to do some online A/B testing? So, like what might that look like in the context of a sales organization? We go, hey, we've got these sales development representatives that roll in every morning, and there's a bunch of new inbound leads. And what they need to do is they need to figure out what's an ordering for the leads, right? So who should we contact first? We got limited time. And like, what's the message or what are we going to offer to them, right? So very clearly what we're trying to do is influence who do the SDRs go after first. The KPI in this case is like, what's the meeting rate? So if we look at 100 leads and the SDR is sort of reaching out to them, what fraction of those are converted into leads, right? Now, the guardrails in this case could be that's great. We want to get more meetings, but we don't want the unsubscribe rate to go up, or we don't want people complaining about how annoying our SDAs are, right? So guardrails could be something like that. Then the baseline, it might be the case, hey, like 8% of the time, 8%, 8 out of 100 of these leads that come in get converted into meetings. It takes about 6 hours to reach out to them. And it would be good enough if we got a 15% lift, if we went from an 8% rate to a 9.2% rate, or maybe a 20% reduction in the amount of time it took us to actually reach out, that would be good. And what we'll do is we'll do A/B testing. So we'll say, all right, hey, we're going to randomize by leads or by territories. And we'll say, you people are going to do the old method, which is just like think about it and figure out who you should contact. Then what we'll do is we'll have this AI system that's going to be ranking, and we're going to measure the sort of conversion and the guardrails for 2 to 4 weeks, right? So that's what it needs to look like. It needs to be very specific. And I will say that I have seen many times where there's an AI project that we've worked on, and we're like doing what they asked us to do, and somebody from the C-suite rolls around and goes, "Okay, like show me how this is helping me," right? And then people scramble to tell a story. So having the story in place at the beginning is just incredibly helpful. All right. Now, the next thing, which is a real killer, is kind of the data reality mismatch. And I'll say that there are sort of two flavors of this that I tend to see. I think most organizations are like pretty realistic, right? So they've got this data, and if you go in and you say, "Hey," right, it's just you and me. Tell me, like, how good do you think your data is? They're like relatively good at sort of figuring it out, right? Or giving you a good story. So here's this AI gives us real-time insights from all of our data. That's great. What data? And then you look over and your data is a pile of garbage. Now, again, it is very rare. I think most organizations don't have a pile of garbage data. A more common occurrence is this sort of it's a thing where you go, hey, we've got all this great data, and we believe that the data is good, and the great and powerful Oz, is your data. And then at some point, somebody goes, well, let's take a little bit closer look. Let's look behind the curtain, and behind the curtain, you're a little disappointed. Now, the way this manifests itself is typically the gestalt feel about the data is like, we got our data house pretty much in order. Um, but for a particular initiative, as you pull the curtain back and go for this initiative, how does our data look? Sometimes you're a little disappointed, right? So, like, what actually happens? Rarely the data doesn't exist. So, right, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to, help my sales development representatives pick the next person that they should talk to. And, it turns out that we're not capturing the data about which individual people we set up meetings with, right? That's actually pretty rare. I think when somebody says, "Hey, we want to work on this initiative and we need data," the data is typically there. What is much more common is the data exists, but it's not easily accessible. So we see lots of cases where different organizations own the data. They're in silos, they are in different data sets. There's all kinds of mismatches between, like, you'd like to kind of connect up these bits of data, but it's just hard, right? Very common. Sometimes the data is like not as usable as you would like. There's sort of missing fields, there's duplicate data. That's super common. Um, Occasionally the data needs some label, right? So did this person respond to this particular outreach email or not? Or the labels aren't sort of really aligned with the decisions. Sometimes there's bias, right? So, coverage is skewed, and oh, sorry, sorry, I had a cat fight going on behind me. And in other cases, the data is just not timely, right? Like it's coming in 2 days after we need to make a decision, right? That happens a lot. So, like, what should you do instead? One thing is, I think it's really important to have a single data owner and a decision owner. And I hate the business term, you need a single throat to choke. I think what you really need is you need somebody who is looking at the data holistically and says, I see it all. I understand where everything lives to the best of my ability, and I can help you sort of work through the issues around getting it together, thinking about quality and things like that. It's also the case that you need to sort of fund data labeling as kind of a first class thing. We actually worked with a company one time. We were doing license plate recognition, automatic license plate recognition. And they had two people, um, and they were, like the manager and an engineer who was very talented. And they actually would sit down and spend hours a day doing labeling. Like, here's a license plate. I'm going to look at that and write down what I think that is. And so they were very successful. And in part, they were successful because they said, look, not fun, but we're going to go in and we're going to add annotations to the data set that's needed. I think you have to treat data pipelines as products, right? You got to do monitoring. You got to have agreements about performance on those things. And then finally, this one is super important, right? If I were to, like, other than like data owner, like start with a small slice of data that has high quality data and clear value. Um, I've seen the following thing happen. So, a company says, "Hey, we've got a big need. We need to get this thing done." And we go, "Okay, we can do that. And here's the data that you would need to, to make that happen." And they've got the data, but then they go, "Well, we really don't want to get started until we have our whole data house in order," right? So maybe the data that they are need to work on, it's the living room in the house. They just need to clean the living room. They don't need to clean the entire house, right? So I think it's important to say, what data do we need? What's relevant to this problem? Let's spend some time getting that in order, and don't feel like you've got to clean up sort of that entire pile of data that you've got lying around. The other reason that this can be a problem is I've also seen cases where a company says, "All right, we're going to build a data lake. We're going to get all this data into the lake." And then what happens is you spend a lot of time doing that because that can be very challenging, right? As I said before on the previous slide, data silos, privacy, different organizations own the data. You can spend a lot of time doing that, and you wind up going, okay, like, all right, we spent a lot of money and we got all our data together, but what was the impact of the AI project? And you're like, well, we haven't gotten to that yet. So this is important, right? Like start with a small slice of data that you can. Okay, so another failure mode is what I'm calling the wrong approach. So let's suppose you want to open a can of soup and it doesn't have a pop top lid. I can't tell if that can that I grabbed, maybe it does. Let's pretend it doesn't, right? So you got to open a can of soup. You should use the tool that's appropriate for that particular job. And so, the metaphor here is the Campbell soup is the problem, right? It's a problem that you're trying to solve in your organization. Let's use a can opener. A lot of times I see people saying, let's use a chainsaw. And by that, I mean maybe a very simple old school machine learning or AI method that's been around since I was a young graduate student, like a decision tree is going to be appropriate. And then somebody goes, well, oh, sorry, that says Claude Open. That's a typo in my slate. It should be Claude Opus, right? Claude Opus 4.6. We're going to throw the world's most powerful large language model at sort of opening this can of soup. So it is very important to try and pick an approach that's appropriate. And this is one thing that I harp on a lot inside the company is there's a tendency, especially these days, to go, we're going to throw Gen AI at it. But it turns out that if what you've got is you've got some weird bottleneck with approvals or handoffs or forms being routed, or the ownership of something is unclear, it's not a prediction problem. It could be just that you need some rules or you need an improved workflow. And it might be the case that machine learning can help you figure out what those rules are, but you don't necessarily need to like go, boom, let's throw an LLM on that thing. The other thing that can be a problem is you need to understand sort of, is it like a structured data problem or is it an unstructured data problem? So, for example, if you've got some deterministic processing, like I need to route things or do validation or do some like fancy calculations, using an LLM on that is not good because LLMs in general are going to be unpredictable. You would want to use something that's a bit more controllable, and a bit more sort of deterministic. Or if the core challenge is to understand ambiguity in language, so we did a project a long time ago before language models where the problem was to turn insurance company rules about when medical procedures would be approved, which were in text, right? There's this crazy text that says, well, if you were diagnosed in the last year and you haven't had this procedure and you also don't have a diagnosis of this thing, then we'll approve it. Otherwise, we won't. Long, complicated documents. We needed to turn those things into rules, and the core challenge was language ambiguity. It was really hard when we did it. These days, it would be much easier. In that case, building rules is not the right thing. Like sort of like rule-based systems are not the right way to go because they're brittle. You want something that has the flexibility of a language model. And then sometimes, we'll see over customization happening too early. So we're going to pull an off the shelf model. We want to prove that we've got value, that the data's there, that we've sort of dealt with the weird cases. Maybe then you can go and start doing fine tuning or building custom models. And this one is one that I harp on all the time is let's use a model that's the right size for the problem, right? Small, cheap models can be awesome. Maybe sometimes a very simple three-layer neural network will work. I don't need a transformer model to do everything, sort of a bigger, more complicated model. Use the thing that is right sized for the approach, right? So, what do you do instead? You sort of think about it, right? Is this a task with sort of simple deterministic rules that are clear? Let's go that route. Is it a prediction from structured data? Then let's do classical machine learning. Those models are more interpretable, but let's also do some monitoring to make sure that everything is still running smoothly as time goes by. Is it language ambiguity? Then let's use large language models, but put some guardrails around it. And is it high stakes, right? So we've certainly done work in places where there were legal ramifications for the company. Imagine that you're a law firm and you're sort of looking at contracts, right? Um, Large language models can help with that. They can help you understand contracts and compare them to other contracts and sort of figure out what laws might be relevant. But you got to make sure that you say the right thing. So in those cases, maybe we need an assistive model, right? We'll sort of, hey, we'll make a suggestion, we'll cite, and we'll have guardrails that say, I'm a language model. I probably should not be making this decision. Let me escalate it to a human. And then this sort of crawl, walk, run progression is a good one, right? So start out with sort of a kind of a simple thing, add machine learning for the hard part, and then maybe consider sort of fine tuning if the ROI is proven. Okay, so next kind of problem that happened that we see a lot is it worked until we put it into production. And the problem is as follows, and I alluded to this earlier. Um, if you think about effort, so that long line with the arrow at the end is how much effort is involved. So, there's some effort involved in having a good idea, but I think a lot of people who are sitting inside companies really know what the pain points are, right? Like I deal with this every day, and this is really annoying to me. Here's an idea of what we could do. Now, the amount of effort that it takes to get from the good idea to the cool demo is very small, and that's the power of Gen AI tools, right? So again, if I have an idea, I can run Claude Code and get a thing running in an hour, for example, depending on the complexity of the task, right? So the power of AI these days is that you can operationalize your idea very quickly. But if you look on the right-hand side over there, production deployment is still very hard, right? It's hard to get code into production because there are lots of things to consider. I still think like as of today, my sense is that the tools are not good at writing production code. And so there's this gap, right? So what happens is like the common problems are there's not a deployment path. I've been guilty of this before. Somebody goes, "Hey, we want to write code to do X." I do it in a Jupyter notebook. And it's like it runs on my machine, but it doesn't run in the production environment. Like I have done that. Sometimes there are environment mismatches, right? So you're like working on slightly different data. You've developed this thing with a small subset of the data. And then when you start blasting large amounts of data in it, it breaks or the distribution is different. You don't do monitoring, right? Like, okay, here's a cool demo, but it turns out that what happens is the data distribution is changing or there are data outages. There's no governance around a demo. Like, how do we manage privacy and security and auditability, sorry. And then like, what do you do when something goes wrong? Like when something goes wrong in a demo, you go, oh, that was weird. Let me restart the demo. But that doesn't happen when it's in production. And then, the a big thing about AI projects is that they tend to need lots of iteration. So when the pilot ends and the performance decays, and users start losing trust, you have to reinvest, right? Okay. So what executives tend to see when this thing happens is like, oh, we got these like costs are rising. We're putting a ton of money. We had this demo. It took a week to get this thing that looked amazing, and then now you're telling me it's going to take 3 months. Like, what's going on? The reliability feels unpredictability and people aren't adopting, right? Because if you just roll the demo out to somebody and go, hey, put this in your workflow, and it's got a lot of problems, then they're not happy. And then other teams are going to come in and say, whoa, we got to push back the launch date, or maybe issues emerge after the launch, right? So what do you do? So here's a lesson that I've learned. We've got our CTO is really, really good at getting code into production. Like that's his sort of like his one of his magic powers is to be able to do that and sort of understand all the issues around it. And one thing I've learned is you got to think production first, right? So don't go off and develop in a notebook on your laptop, which is my default thing that I always want to do. You got to look at real data flows. You have to be thinking about latency, uptime, and cost. How much money am I spending on calls to LLMs? How long is it going to take, right? So if I've got some very complicated collection of guardrails that need to fire every time a user sends in a request, they're not going to be happy if they're sitting there for 30 seconds, right? You also, I think, need to have lightweight governance. So you have to think about governance early on. You don't want to make it so onerous that people balk at it, but it has to be thought about. And then you also have to think about monitoring from day one, right? So how do we sort of watch this thing? How do we make sure that the decisions that it's making are good? Do we need to have humans in the loop, right? So maybe there's a domain expert that gets an email 5 times a day that goes, hey, the AI system just told a customer this. What do you think about that? Right. And then also think about shipping improvements on a cadence. All right. So this might be my last problem, sort of failure mode. So stakeholders and incentives. So stakeholders can be misaligned and incentives can be misaligned, right? So executive sponsors typically get super excited about the technology. They see generative AI doing these amazing things, and they want you to really quickly get to a compelling demo and make visible progress, right? The people who are going to run it are going to want something that's reliable, that's not going to disrupt their workflow, and they want accountability, right? Like who do I go and talk to when this thing isn't doing what it's supposed to do or what it says it's going to do? The IT people, they really care about auditability and minimizing new risk. And the data and ML teams who love working on this stuff are going to kind of focus in on metrics, right? How accurate is it? And I want to deliver this thing, right? So when you get a lot misalignment on these things, often what happens is it stalls at the prototype phase, right? Like, hey, we got this great prototype, but like nobody says, okay, I'll own it and I'll deploy it. Or you have meetings that talk about alignment. Like we're aligned, but there aren't any decisions. And you think about success as activity. We've launched a pilot, but we haven't moved to KPI, which is what you need to think about, right? So the way I think about it is, if different people have different ideas of what sort of success looks like, there's this tail chasing that goes on, and it's interesting because I think that the fact that you have different ideas about what success looks like tends to be kind of latent, right? It's hidden. Um, and it sort of doesn't get surfaced as explicitly as often as you think it would, right? Okay, so those are the failure modes. I just have one slide of concluding thoughts, and then I would love to see if there are questions. These are kind of the key takeaways, right? So think about these things. If you took one slide with you, it would be this slide. So think about outcomes, not models, right? Or outcomes, not technology. It's not, hey, we want to be data driven. We want Gen AI. We've got fear of missing out, right? What I always tell people is find a pain point. Find a thing that your employees or your customers are complaining about, and you believe that if you actually made that better, it would move the needle for you, and then identify the needle, right? So let's pick a thing that can have impact, define the KPI, figure out what the baseline is, and then also say how much above baseline do I need to be for this to be useful for me. I also believe that you have to treat data like a product. So sometimes data is just this thing that happens, right? So customers come, they do stuff, we log it, but I think you have to think about governance, right? Who's sort of in charge of the data? Who verifies that there's enough quality there? And then, sort of it's this idea that kind of reliable data is what makes AI scalable and useful. So our CEO, Steven, is very fond of saying that something like data is the fuel that drives AI. And I think that's exactly right. So without the data, it's not gonna do well. Also, as I said just a minute ago, think about production from day one. Don't let somebody like me go off and develop on their laptop in a notebook using sample data and then hand that over because again, I've seen it happen. I've caused it to happen and it's not pretty. You really have to have somebody who understands what it takes to get code into production early on. So the decisions that you're making are going to make that transition smoother. Also, this notion of just like keep it simple, use an approach that works. Um, Use the smallest subset of the data that is necessary to make that thing work. And once you've established ROI, what happens is everybody wants to talk to you at that point, right? So everybody inside the company, you go, hey, we actually had worked with a company one time that was trying to reduce their account receivables. They built uh, a essentially it was an old school machine learning method that would look at one of their customers and go, hey, if we gave them a phone call, do we think they would clear up their bill at that point? And they used fairly simple methods. It was sort of like tree-based methods. There were some decision trees, maybe a random forest going on in there, which is still super powerful, a very powerful method even today. And it turns out they proved ROI. They did a great like A/B test with their internal people. And once they established that ROI, all kinds of doors open for them inside the company. So I think, aligning ownership and incentives is sort of accountable owner, right? So somebody's got to say, yep, I'm going to own this thing. We're trying to move this KPI. We've got these guardrails in place to make sure that things don't devolve in other ways, and we're going to move fast. I think planning for iteration, AI is a living capability, right? So it's not sort of like engineering in the sense that I think with engineering teams, you expect we're going to be agile. We're going to have, 2 week sprints and we're going to bang out this functionality. And this thing is worth 5 points and it's going to take that person that 2 week sprint to do it. What happens with AI, especially with generative AI, is things are a little squishier, right? Because again, a lot of it's sort of focused on visual understanding or language generation. And those things are by definition squishy. And so you have to sort of plan for iteration. And then also, I think finding a trusted partner can accelerate success. So, one thing that I've often seen inside companies, which is great, is if they're not kind of like a technology company, there can be somebody in there who's like, this AI stuff is amazing. I want to learn about it. I want to take on a project. And what I would, and that's great. Actually, the company that we worked with before on their accounts receivables, that was exactly the situation. There was a manager who was super excited about AI and machine learning. There was a technical guy who really wanted to sort of, kind of learn on the job. And they brought us in as experts who could help them sort of narrow their focus. Because what happens is, if you haven't done it before, if you don't have experience, like the entire world is open to you, right? I don't know. I could use a decision tree or a language model or logistic regression or a diffusion. I have no idea what to do. The trusted partner can come in and sort of like narrow that search space for you and say, we believe that this approach is probably going to work for you. And then they kind of guide you through that. And so there are many times when we've worked in tandem with teams where we say, here's the approach we think we're going to take. We will work with your team. We will build the solution together. You guys can take it over if you want to, when we're done with it. But then what you've done is you've sort of gone through that process once, and then it's much easier for you to turn the crank again. So anyway, that was that was a lot of key takeaways. But that's the end of the presentation. So I appreciate you listening, and I'd be happy to take questions. And maybe Diane, you can help me if there are.
Great. Yeah, great. Thanks, Tim, for a great presentation. I think we've got all the questions taken care of, actually. So nice job throughout. And as I said before, we'll be sending out the slides and the recording after this. And we hope to see you at a future webinar from Synaptic. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everybody for joining.
All right. Thank you.